Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first Lunch and Learn for Peer Review 101. I am Caitlyn Allen. I am the Director of External Affairs for the Patient Safety Authority and Managing Editor for Patient Safety. Also joining me as presenters are Eugene Meyer, who is the Associate Editor for Patient Safety, and Zane Wolf, who is a repeat author, reviewer. She's a nursing professor, just a wealth of knowledge, and she has an immense amount of experience being not only an author, but also a reviewer. So we'll be sharing an overview of the peer review process and what it's like to do review. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screens, and hopefully these Zoom gods will be kind and we won't have any technical difficulties. So hopefully folks are able to see my screen, and I'm not seeing any indication that you can't. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So thank you again for joining us. And so we're going to give an overview of peer review, what it's like to go through the process, and then some tips we've learned over the years about how to do the best peer review that you can. So starting off with a brief overview for how the publication process works. So the manuscripts will come into the journal, and then we'll do a quick quality check. So that involves doing a plagiarism check to make sure that there wasn't anything intentional or unintentional. One thing I did not appreciate before I started becoming an editor is that you can even unintentionally self-plagiarize, where you've pulled passages of your text that you use for another article because you think, oh, I published this somewhere else and it was my own words, so surely that must be all right. But depending on the rules of the journal in which you're submitting, more times than not, you need to rephrase or use quote marks, something to make sure that you're not plagiarizing anyone, including yourself. And then we'll also do for our international submissions to make sure that there aren't any language issues we need to work through in order to be able to send it out for a peer review. So once we go through the quality checks, then we'll do an in-house editorial review. We have a phenomenal biostatistician who is our data editor. He'll go through and then look for any quirks with the data, even things as little as typos, or if there are different statistical analyses that he would recommend over another. One common thing is authors like to say that a change that they found was significant, but as anyone who is in academia knows, that significant means something. So if you're going to put that down on your manuscript, you got to make sure that it actually carries with what that word means in our world. And then our executive director, who's our editor-in-chief, she'll also take a pass from a clinical perspective to make sure it warrants sending it out. So sometimes we'll have to flag articles based on either the data or the clinical side, and they won't make it into peer review. So we will reject and help encourage folks to rewrite. But assuming everything goes well and we accept the publication for peer review, then we'll go out and then we'll submit it and then reach out to any of you who are on this call or your colleagues in similar fields, and then we'll send it out. We always try to get 3 reviewers. And so that way, in case there is a disagreement amongst the reviewers about what to do with it, and we'll get into that in a little bit. So this way, if we get 3, then hopefully there's a tiebreaker for what to do with it. And then after it goes through your reviews, we will send it along to the authors and then ask them to make any revisions. One thing that's normal when you are reviewing papers, we ask the authors to respond to every single comment. There may be a reason why they didn't choose to use this type of graph, or they didn't choose to use this analysis. So we don't require them to make all of the suggested changes, but we do at least acknowledge them. So if you chose not to use a bar graph instead of a pie chart, or a t-test over a p-test, what was your reasoning behind that? And then depending on the level of revisions that are required, then we may send it back for peer review, and then authors make more revisions, and that goes through until we are in a position where hopefully we are able to so to accept the paper for publication. So it does not always happen at the end of this process, and we'll get into that a little bit later, is the most common reasons why peer reviewers tend to reject a manuscript. So the different kinds of peer review. There are three main types in academia. So to give people a general sense of how they work. So there is double blind, which is the version of peer review that we use, in which the authors don't know who the reviewers are and the reviewers don't know who the authors are. This is traditionally been the most encouraged form of peer review, because the thought is that this will lead to the most unbiased type of review, because you don't have to have any concern that rival institutions, or maybe you know the author from a previous life. We think it's cleanest if you're going in there with a clean slate and then you just judge the work on its merit. So this is been long-standing preferred version of peer review, which is why we use it at patient safety. But traditionally, this is what most journals have done. And then there is single blind, where the reviewers will know who the authors are, or vice versa. It's usually where the reviewers will know who the authors are. The thought is to give them a little bit more context. So, but with that, there can be some chance for bias. And then sometimes it can go the other way, where if you have a very specific, a very niche research topic, sometimes authors will recommend specific reviewers, because like if you're working on something so specific, there may only be so many people in the field who have the expertise in order to accurately judge the manuscript. So we do take suggestions for reviewers. And then it doesn't come often, but depending on the paper, sometimes we do. And then the third version is open peer review. So with this is where everybody knows everything. And it even gets to the point where sometimes reviews are publicly shared. So sometimes journals will post their reviews along with the manuscript, including disclosing who the names of the reviewers are for that specific paper. So it does make everything very transparent. So that is something that some journals have started to move towards, in that spirit of transparency. We, again, use the double blind because we want to make sure that by the end of the day, the manuscripts are in as good of shape as they can be before they get published, because the journal articles then get published and disseminated to clinicians all over the world. So we want to have the most accurate and robust information that we can. So we think it makes more sense to kick the tires and make sure that there's a non-biased version of a review. So what happens if reviewers disagree with each other? When I first became a managing editor, it was like 3 weeks later, I went to a conference about editing. So I was fresh out of the gate, which was great because I was just a sponge and just absorbing all of these things about how to be an editor. And I heard some stories that seemed like they were just campfire horror stories that editors would tell each other. And one was about how often it is where reviewers will disagree with each other. So you'll send a paper out to the chair of something at Hopkins and they will love it. And then you send the same paper to the chair of something at Mass General and they hate it. So what do you do with that? Which is why we always try to have the 3 reviewers. So this way there could be a tie breaker in this case. And this does happen more often than you may expect. So in these situations, there's a couple things that could happen. We've had a couple manuscripts where we could only get 2 reviewers on a manuscript. They both were making such strong, coherent arguments about why this paper was great and merited being published, or why we should reject it and then never think about anything from those authors ever again. So in one of those situations, we actually just set up meetings between the authors and the reviewers. So we let them talk things out. So that helps. So in some instances, we will go down that road. And then sometimes we have de-identified, but then shared the review with the other reviewers so they could see each other's points of views. And that helped them come to some kind of agreement that, oh, I see what you said here. I didn't think of it that way. And then help to some kind of middle ground. So more often than not, don't be surprised if you are reviewing a paper and then you get reached out to by the editorial team to try and reconcile some things. So another question that we get from reviewers a lot is, what kind of information should I be giving the authors? Because I am afraid that I am, quote, being mean. And there's something about this paper, I think it's great, but there's a section of it that I have a lot of issues with. So what do I do? So, and they'll reach out and they don't want to share anything where they think they're being hypercritical of the manuscript. So our advice that we give all the reviewers who reach out with this is that your job as a reviewer is we reach out to you as the content experts, that we really appreciate your perspective and we want to take your feedback and then give that to the authors and then help them make the paper as best as they can. So we always encourage everybody to be as honest as they can, but also to be constructive. So there are certain ways to phrase things, but don't worry about being mean as long as you are constructive. But the more feedback that you can give the authors, the better the paper will be. And for our peer review form, we have a rubric where we lay out certain criteria and then people can grade it from 1 to 5. But then at the end of it, there's a section just for authors and then a section just for the editorial team. So we have an option for the reviewers to give feedback to us that we can then take into account. Sometimes we've had to, sometimes the honest section of the peer review form can be a little critical. So, but if they make good points there that they haven't made elsewhere, we'll take their point and then rephrase it and then put that and then give that feedback back to the authors. So if there's something that you as reviewers want to, like a point you want to make, but you're afraid you're being hypercritical or you're being too picky and you don't know what to do about it, if there's not a mechanism in whatever form the journal you are reviewing for has, I would suggest reaching out to whichever editor has given you the paper and say, look, I'm not sure where else to say this, but I really have a concern about this. I think this could be a good paper, but it's really important that they change this about it. So don't be afraid to be critical and always look for an opportunity to share what you can in order to make the paper the best that it is. So what are the common reasons why reviewers tend to reject papers? One is the novelty, is that most of the people, I'm assuming, who are on this call are in the healthcare sector, because that is where our journal lives. But for anyone, they're busy professionals reading journal articles. You don't want to read something that you've read 6 times before. So it's really important that if you're going to put forth an article, then it's something that's worth the person's time who's going to be reading it. So sometimes we've gotten in papers, they've been a really great study, they've gotten really great results, but we've seen it 10 times before. So this is probably the reason why people recommend rejecting a paper more often than not. The second area is the appropriateness of the audience. We've gotten in some really, really interesting papers. There was one, it was a legal paper that was submitted. It was tangentially related to patient safety, but really, really a stretch, incredibly well written, well researched, but we were not the audience because our journal is primarily for working clinicians and administrators, but really the front line, like the boots on the ground folks. So this was not the appropriate audience. So we ended up rejecting that manuscript and then help them find another journal that would be a better fit because we want to make sure that the stuff we publish is most appropriate for our journal. So that might be, so keep that in mind when you're looking at papers to make sure that it's a good fit for the audience. And if you have a question about that, feel free to reach out to the editorial team. Like, I like this paper, I think this could be good, but are these the readers that you see? So would this be a good fit? Another one is the methodology. We've had some rejections because of this, that it's a really interesting problem they're trying to solve. The background's great, But when you started to pick apart the methodology, there were so many holes and so many limitations, it just couldn't be overcome. So that's another common area. So especially if you're asked as a content expert for something where you are specifically asked to pick things apart, don't be afraid to, because one of the worst things that can happen is if you have to end up retracting the paper. It happens in publishing because if there's bad information out there, you want to get it off the books, but it certainly would be better to kick the tires now than it would be to have to publish something and then retracting it. And then another thing that comes up a lot is if the manuscript doesn't have any results, that the team went through all of this and that was something that they shouldn't have, that they didn't come up with any results. And is it even worth publishing? Because what if a hospital or a facility were to repeat that? But we tell people that that's okay, because maybe it's important for people to know that if you do X, Y, and Z, it's not going to lead to results, or it may, but you need to tweak something for your facility. So just because a paper doesn't have significant results doesn't necessarily mean that it warrants not publishing it. So keep that in mind. And so So before I turn it over to my co-host, who I am hoping is able to join us, I was asked, does anybody have any questions for me from the editor's perspective for peer review before I turn it over to Zane? Okay. Well, see, and let me pull up first.
I have it. Is that okay?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Let's see if we can get to the slideshow. All right. Let me pull this a little off. So some of what I'm going to present comes from the perspective of being a journal editor for about 25 years and also reviewing for different journals in addition to patient safety. And one of the things I think you're going to see is there will be some messages that are similar to Caitlyn's excellent presentation. And what I really want to emphasize is kind of the responsibility of peer reviewers to the disciplines and the professions to which they belong. And one of the things that I've been concerned about with the journal I edit is that I want to make sure that the peer reviewers get acknowledged. And a lot of times this is on the masthead of the journal. Of course, a lot of the journals are electronic, but it's really good to be able to see that you're recognized for what you do. Some journals have published at the end of the year, for example, the reviewers for that particular year, because they might have gotten a little bit outside of the standard editorial review board that they use. So it's really important that the peer reviewers recognize how important they are in terms of the entity of the journal and to the profession, and that they really do help build the discipline and the profession through their critique and also prevent the problems that are with incorrect information, irrelevant findings, claims that are inflated, and basically imposing their personal views on that. And one of the things that there's a lot of discussion in the nursing editor world, and that is of the concerns that we have with predatory journals and also predatory conferences. So we have to sort of rely on the fact that it does take a bit of time to do a peer review. And it's important to be skeptical about some of these journals. One of the things I think it's important to recognize as well is that when you are in fact emphasizing, what is going on as you do the peer review and critique it, that you're really recognizing authors' work. And I just put this up because it has some of the contributions of the authors, and that can come either from the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors or from Credit, which is out of Elsevier. But the authors have done at least a lot of work, I would assume most of the time, to get to this point. So respecting the work, even though you may not think it's meritorious in terms of being published, is really important. So the professional responsibility of the peer reviewer is very, very concerning to the editors of journals. And a lot of times there are subject specialists in terms of content, methodological or methods specialists, statistical analysis experts that Caitlyn mentioned that you have there, which is great. And also maybe you don't have as many qualitative analysis experts, but it's really good to be able to know this. And some of the platforms of journals make that clear. And if you're invited to be on an editorial review board, there are a lot of ways to customize what your expertise is. And then the journal editor can go after that and try to make a fit. And it's really important to consider all this professional responsibility. And one of the things I'm seeing in my colleagues in the clinical setting, in big clinical settings across the United States, the healthcare system is putting pressure, at least on some of the nursing folks, to get involved in journals as peer reviewers, for example, and obviously to get published as well. And the other thing that's an advantage in terms of the why do it idea is that you really get alerted to what is new, what's going on scientifically or ethically or legally or whatever within that particular zone of practice and teaching and whatever else you do as researchers. So that to me is very important. And I review for a number of journals, and I always learn from it, even though it does take time to do. The other thing is you can look at it as a why do it in terms of informing you sort of as a continuing education opportunity, even though you're not getting contact hours necessarily. You can also get known as an expert on topics, and you should be putting this on your resume or curriculum vitae. And then you really are helping the discipline profession and that particular journal's quality. The other thing that happens is I see in my writing, and I've been writing for a long time, that I learn things by the way people phrase things and the way people take pieces of information and apart and then put them together. The other thing is, Caitlyn mentioned the settling the conflicting manuscript reviews, but sometimes even the editor has to step in on that. And it's okay if there's conflict because it can be resolved. The other ideas about why do it is that you are supporting the community of subscribers or the open access folks that check in. There's a way to credit yourself through this publins.com so that you know that there's a track record of the reviews that you've done. Remembering that you have a commitment to the editorial people because they rely on you and they in fact make the final decisions. So the whole idea of integrity and quality that Caitlyn was mentioning is really extremely important. And you might be known eventually through the quality of your peer reviews and become invited, in the future, or come invited in the future to join as an associate editor. So that could be one of the advantages of peer review. And one of the things I always remember is something I discussed with my husband. And when I'm sort of talking about how some of my reviewers have been very lovely about their review and kind of tentative about them. And this is sort of the St. Thomas More comment to his executioner. Be not afraid to do thy office, okay? So it's okay to be presenting a critique. And a lot of times I've found that new peer reviewers are very tentative and they want my approval, but they kind of get in the groove. Caitlyn mentioned the types of reviews that goes on, and there are problems in a way with all of them in terms of perceived bias. But one of the things that I've gotten more comfortable with doing is that it's important for, on the editor side, for the editor to do a desk rejection. And that is basically if there is not a good fit with that journal, and it looks also that it really might not contribute in a way, you can take don't be afraid of the office from the editorial view and just do a desk rejection. And what I try to do in the letters available in the journal platform that I use is to suggest that they reformat or that they also, in fact, do something else. But the whole idea of the minor and major revisions that the peer reviewers note is very, very important. The other thing is to make sure that you're consistent with that. And a lot of times I'll get minor revision. I just have one today, and then major revision. And typically then the editor has to figure out how to grade that while sending it back from the peer reviewers to the authors. It's always responsible to complete the review on time for the authors and for the editors so that you're not holding people up. And it's also a learning curve to review for the journal in which you want to be published, because then you're going to see it from the author's side, and I think that's good. The whole idea of treating the manuscript the way that you would want your manuscript to be treated is important. And then one of the things that you need to know is that some of the journal platforms have a 3-point scale or so for the editor to evaluate the peer reviewer's critiques. Now, what you get to know if you have a common group of peer reviewers, and I've just updated ours in the journal I do, is that you do learn some of the best people to send certain manuscripts to. And if, in fact, the peer reviewer is being coercive, which has happened with some of the things I've written, then you have to withdraw it. I remember an ethical challenge years ago related to a non-heart beating donor paper that I wrote, and they wanted to completely change it, and I withdrew the manuscript because it was too coercive. So that's on the author side. If there are any conflicts of interest, most of the platforms have conflicts of interest for the authors, but not necessarily for the peer reviewers. So that would be something that I would recommend that you share with in the critique, in the comments section, which goes to the editors. And if in fact you know the author, because Caitlyn mentioned that there's sometimes these narrow areas where you happen to know what's going on in that area, you have to be cautious if you continue with it, not to allow that to influence your review. But you need to tell the author that in that little kind of box that the reviewers can put comments in for the editors to know. And I also think you've got to be very careful about ideas, and that if you find a great idea in a manuscript, that you don't use it to promote your own advantage. So that's an ethical responsibility there too. It's always good to accept invitations that match your expertise. Sometimes you might not know the content, but you'll know the methodology. And so I think it's okay to be clear about that when you write up the review and post it. It's good to be concise and clear, but also constructive about different points. And superficial or very little comments are an issue. And I have had peer reviewers that have said virtually hardly anything as compared to maybe the other reviewers. And the authors get very troubled by that. So it's really better to do some detail. because they'll say, I didn't see much of anything that I needed to do. And they might have gotten a minor, revision comment, but they really would like to have a little bit more detail. And obviously the checklists that the patient safety uses and other journals use as well, they have their own, are really good to help to organize the content. And with different journals, there's a little more or a little less of that kind of detail. And excuse me, one of the things that I've found in the middle of some reviews is that I lose the reviews that I've typed in because I've been spending some time or some glitch happens in the system electronically. So I'm going to give you a word of advice. Type the review out in Word and then copy it in because it's disappointing to do that. And I've had that experience enough times to give you that idea in terms of maybe being responsible to yourself for your own time commitment. And if in fact the editor approaches you about dramatically different recommendations that they happen to have seen the other reviewers rather's comments, then you have to really deal with that and address the author's questions. But always remember charity and peer review. There's an old New England Journal of Medicine article by Engelfinger that I always liked. It's really short, but that's very important. So after the submission of the manuscript, the editors assess it, and at this point in time, they can decide on the desk rejection and modify the letter. And basically, you can go to the purpose or the mission of the journal and know that you didn't have to deal with this as a peer reviewer. But after the editor looks at the relevance of the submission in relation to the policy and the mission, then they're going to choose the reviewers or referees, hopefully getting to authorities in the field. And then the editor or the managing editor or some other staff sends the information to the peer reviewers and it pops up on their email. And essentially, this is mostly entirely digital, although I'm sure there's some journals that are still a little bit more in both worlds, paper and digital. The due date is given and reminders are sent electronically to peer reviewers by the journal platform, typically. And a lot of times my reviewers will say to me, Zane, I'm sorry, I've been late. I was on vacation, which is always a good thing. And I'll say, it goes automatically out. But if something's going on with you, if there's some stress situation, take a little bit more time. But the platforms do send out the reminders. The 2 or 3 reviewers that are there, as the critique goes on, sometimes it's longer, sometimes it's shorter. The editor's waiting for the revision to come back and is checking to see what comes back. And you can see who's finished and who's not in the audit trails that are available through journal platforms. And then the editor or managing editor sends the reviews out. And the author is then confronted by the queries that they have to deal with. And then, in fact, if it's accepted, there may be an early posting of the journal before it's really finally there. But after acceptance, the manuscript's in the queue for publication, as you can expect. So it's important then to be on top of this, to make sure that you're looking at the PDF version of the manuscript, that you're keeping to the time, usually 2 to 4 weeks, even though that doesn't always happen because of different phases of the year and what people are into. But a lot of times you can make the decision very early on by reviewing the abstract, and that should be coming to you through some of the digital platforms that the journals have. And the other thing is that the journal I edit, for example, has a really eclectic array of types of manuscripts that we receive, from theory and research to essays. We have student papers occasionally. We also have artistic representation, sometimes poetry. So I even have a poetry assistant editor to help us with that. And remember also that not all reviewers are topical experts, as I've said before, statistical experts. So recalling a journal article that I was reviewing for another journal, and I could understand most of the statistics, but I said, I critiqued that part of it and said, but I don't know that statistical task. So I communicated that to the editor so that they would know it. And then not always, if you're a detailed reviewer, there may be other reviewers who aren't as detailed. So it's great to be a detailed reviewer because that really helps both the editor and also obviously the revisions for the authors. So it's always important to take and be very specific about any issues with errors, the designs or the methods, if you have that expertise. Looking at the findings, Caitlyn mentioned that. Thinking about how it advances the field. One of the things I've had accepted with one of my colleagues is an article that has a new measurement instrument in it, and it is really an unusual idea right now. And the editor asked us to write an editorial to explain it for everybody as well. I think it'll be in the same issue in 2025 that the article comes out in. So that's just one thing. It may be good, it may not be good to be that original, as Caitlyn suggested. In terms of missing or inaccurate references, that's an issue. It's very easy right now for peer reviewers and editors to use the DOIs to try to get to a manuscript through the National Library of Medicine and wherever. So that's okay. But remember that the editors are going to pay attention to you and the quality of what you do. Most of them are going to accept what you do. These were mentioned by Caitlyn. It is highly unusual to do an unconditional acceptance of a manuscript, and the other resubmit ideas were presented there as well by Caitlyn, along with rejection. The alternative is that the editor might turn around and say, if there were different reviews, that in fact they might give another opportunity to the authors to review. So that you may not know. You may see an article pop up later in the journal, but you may not always know that that happens. This is a study I found that I think is what happens to articles when people get things back. And so that you can see that maybe in newer authors, when they look at the peer review and they see they have a major revision, they may be completely turned off and not want to take the work in hand and the energy it needs to create a revision of the manuscript. So I like this because you can see what people sometimes do in response to peer reviews, whether they be major or minor. They might go to an article and stay with a quality journal and revise it. They might forget about it or throw it away. They might go to a lower level journal. And essentially, it's very interesting with what happens in response to peer review. So this was the only study I found a little bit ago on that kind of thing. The rejection idea is very important in terms of the critique that reviewers and editors advise authors to pay attention to within rejection. And there are a whole list of these. One of the things that's in the conversation right now among the nursing editors group is that a lot of capstone or complex study projects are coming without them being formatted to fit the journal's author guidelines. And that's important to think about. And then maybe the article hasn't really matched the subscribers. And that could be really big deal. If they totally reject the author guidelines, you're never going to see it as a peer review, as I said before. Or in fact, maybe that even though you did a critique and you recommended minor revisions, for example, the editor might decide when they take the time to go back and look at the array of articles, and sometimes it's hard to keep track of that as an editor, but they'll find that something similar was published in the recent past, so that they might have to reject it. And obviously there's always an issue with ethical conflicts, essentially worrying about human subjects if it's research, I would suspect. But I think also that a lot of times that rejection would turn off an author. You need to really be aware of the fact that the minor changes and major changes might be what happens to everybody because of the unusual acceptance at first glance. One of the things that that we do think about is inappropriate comments, but sometimes it's good advice that the mentor is kind of involved and the editor gets involved in all of this. When you look at the challenges of the peer review process, there is a really big problem with what the scientists would call inter-rater reliability. And that has a lot to do with topic, content expertise, method expertise, and so forth. And in fact, that's an issue, at least in one level, but I think editors see that that's just the way it is. It's pretty much accepted. The other thing is that you may want non-desired reviewers to look at your work, and that not many journals that I've seen that I've reviewed for anyway do I see that in. And then maybe the peer reviewer is aware of all the submissions and publications and maybe even the rejection rates of certain authors. That might be if it's a small community and a journal that has that kind of limitation. But it's always important to use the fair, transparent, rigorous, helpful ideas when you're looking at the peer review process. Famous authors, if you know the famous authors, that might improve the odds of their publication. However, there's a certain amount of gamemanship on the alternative that basically people might cite you, the editor, because they think it's going to help them. And that's happened with the journal that I edit, because I have a couple instruments that are out there that measure nurse caring, for example. And I think I've definitely had the sensation, let's say, that they're trying to please me, but it's really the peer reviewers that have to take that responsibility and do really well with that. The other thing is that less popular authors might not be published, and that has to do with some of the gamemanship that's in the literature about some of the challenges of the peer review process. So other challenges are that some of the peer reviewers' messages might be denied, and that in fact the peer reviewers are really too busy, and they might be asked to come back within a short amount of time. And I can tell how often, how long it's been since I've asked peer reviewers because of my journal management system, that platform. And then I can say, okay, if I'm going to ask somebody to review it again with a very short time, then I need to beg them to do it because they're the best ones for that journal. So you might be asked to do something pretty fast again, because the editor recognizes your expertise. And sometimes now that there are retirements coming on, at least in the nursing world, for example, that retired people might not be interested, or maybe they'll find it interesting to do because they enjoy doing it. So that's it. Mentioned before the lack of knowledge about the statistical or the qualitative analysis ability. So that may be something that I have seen in some of my reviewers. So I'm very careful about that. And I've gone to appoint people or invite people to the editorial the review board, because I need people with more stat background. And that I've been pretty conscious about, so that, you can have a couple, 2 to 3 people with different kinds of expertise reviewing the journal. The other thing is that sometimes people are too busy. It might be the beginning of the semester if you're dealing with an academic, or it may be that people are on vacation in the summer and there's a big delay and you get turned down. The other thing is some of the imposition of the peer reviewers' own work on the publication. So you have to be really cautious about that. And that's there. Well, when you think about peer review, it's basically to think of yourself as a mentor, I think. And so there's something called the developmental approach that's in the literature. And I think it's important to think about how you can really help people move along in their career by being charitable, but very prescriptive about what you think needs to be done. So the honest, excellent feedback is really good. Strong critique is really good. Timely is really good too, so that you don't hold up the author or the editors and so forth. So I think that's a great way to look at peer reviewers, because in fact, that's what you're doing. You're contributing to young, middle level, or very experienced authors, and everybody benefits from peer review. And I think that's important. Now, most of the journals don't like you to give grammatical and let's say punctuation kinds of word choice kinds of things, unless you really need to have that. For example, a translated from another language manuscript. But you really have to be careful about what the journal expects of you in relationship to the peer review process. I think it's okay to say no jargon, for example, but you might not want to be the minute grammatical and punctuation expert. So sometimes journals don't want you to do that. There's only one journal that I review for that they kind of like that, that I actually edit on the manuscript and send that back. So you just have to be really careful about what you say and the way you say it. I think it's okay to say a sentence is not understandable, and to make that point, and to see if there's an incorrect reference citation that you happen to know, for example, or that you locate through the DOI. That's important as well. One of the things that a lot of journals expect is some kind of a revision matrix. And this is important to set up. And I'm going to just show you an example of one, but I've just revised an article in detail that is on this instrument we've created and we've tested preliminarily. And I used the matrix in terms of the first and the second reviewer to very specifically copy their comments to the reviewer side and then to respond. So this is important. And the reason I'm including this today is because you might be asked to do a second review on a paper. And that happens a lot, I think. And because of that, you're going to have to deal with the matrix, hopefully, that the authors send. So I think it's really nice to know that some journals are more explicit about the format than others, but this is very important. And in my journal platform, it gets included in the whole process as a download of what then the editor can see, and that the editor might send out to the reviewers that did the first review of the article, or if they don't want to do it, they might have to go to another set of reviewers. So that's that. With the second cycle of article reviews, if you get invited as a peer reviewer to do that, you're going to see that the designation locator of the journal manuscript is then appended by an R for revision, and R1 if it's the first, and R2 if it's the second one. So that's kind of my perspectives today. I hope this was okay for you. And I had a good time with it, and Caitlyn helped me kind of focus a little bit, because I had, I was taking one sort of level, and I just find it an interesting experience to think about this in a kind of more outsider's way than I usually do. So it was good for me to do it. So thank you, Caitlin, for the invitation.
Well, Zane, thank you for that. And with a couple minutes left, I want to see if anybody has questions. But Zane, of all of the wonderful points that she raised, the most important foundational one was the golden rule of publishing, that treat a manuscript as a reviewer the same way you would want a manuscript to be treated if you were the author. Because imagine you're the author, you spend umpteen hours drafting something, you go into something, you submit it to the journal, and there's something, some blind spot, some flaw with the manuscript that you didn't recognize, but a reviewer is in the position where they could. If you were that author, wouldn't you want the reviewer to flag it and then help them make the manuscript better in order to get ready for publication, instead of not saying something, letting the paper be published, and then having to make a correction or a retraction? So that's, as Zane said, you're here as the experts helping to guide them and really as a mentor for the authors. So if you take nothing else away from today's webinar, please just remember the golden rule of publication, as Zane so eloquently put it. So with the couple minutes we have left, does anybody have any questions? Sure, we covered everything so thoroughly that there's nothing left to ask about the peer review process. But if you weren't already able to tell, Zane has an immense amount of experience as a reviewer and an author. So if there's anything anybody wants to ask before we break. So not seeing any hands. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, yes, this recording will be made available, and then we are going to be posting it on YouTube and then slicing and dicing into chunks, because we are, as everyone knows, celebrating peer review week. So we're going to make sure that we do publish this and make it available later.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone, and a huge thank you to Zane for a wonderful presentation. So, and please, if you have any questions about anything you think of later on, please reach out to myself, or if you have a question for Zane, we'll make sure that we get it to her. But thank you again, everyone. This was great. Thank you.